Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A new Senate investigation confirmed the Pentagon sought the help of military psychologists as early as 2002 to devise aggressive interrogation methods that are considered torture by many legal and human rights groups. According to the Senate report, in July 2002, the Pentagon's then General Counsel, William Haines, sent a memo inquiring about a military program known as SEER, Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape. The program was originally designed to train Army soldiers how to survive enemy interrogations, but the U.S. military reverse-engineered the program and used it on prisoners held overseas. Haines is scheduled to testify today before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Meanwhile, a major investigation by the McClatchy newspapers has concluded the U.S. has wrongfully imprisoned perhaps hundreds of men in overseas prisons, including Guantanamo, on the basis of flimsy or fabricated evidence, old personal scores, or bounty payments. McClatchy interviewed 66 former prisoners. About half had no ties to militant groups or activities. Only 7 had connections to the leadership of al-Qaeda. In California, dozens of gay and lesbian couples were married Monday night as the state performed its first legally recognized same-sex weddings. California is the second state, after Massachusetts, to marry same-sex couples, but it's the first ready to grant licenses to couples from any state. We'll have more on the story later in the broadcast. Former Vice President Al Gore has endorsed Senator Barack Obama for president. Gore spoke at an Obama campaign rally in Detroit on Monday.
After 8 years of lost jobs and lower wages, we need change. After 8 years of incompetence, neglect, and failure, we need change. After 8 years in which our Constitution has been dishonored and disrespected, we need change. After 8 years of the worst, most serious foreign policy mistakes in the entire history of our nation, we need change.
Barack Obama praised Gore for his years of public service.
I want to thank, most of all, Al Gore. I want to thank him for his support. I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank Al Gore for everything that he is doing to ensure that we leave a planet that is better for our children.
In other campaign news, Obama's hired Senator Hillary Clinton's former campaign manager, Patty Solis Doyle, to be chief of staff of Obama's future running mate. Many Clinton supporters view the decision as proof Obama will not pick Clinton as his vice president. Clinton ousted Doyle as her campaign manager in February, and the two are said to be barely on speaking terms. Meanwhile, the presumptive Republican nominee, John McCain's called for the lifting of a federal ban on offshore oil drilling. McCain said such a move is needed to help the country become more energy independent. McCain's call is expected to be controversial even within his own party. The Republican governors of California and Florida, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Charlie Crist, both oppose drilling off their states' coastlines. In Afghanistan, Taliban fighters have seized control of 7 villages near Kandahar, Afghanistan's second-largest city. The Taliban offensive comes just days after militants blew up a prison in Kandahar, allowing over 1,000 prisoners to escape. Amnesty International is accusing the United States and other nations of evading its responsibility toward Iraqi refugees by promoting a false picture of the security situation in Iraq. Amnesty's Smata Reynolds said, quote, "While the U.S. government's rhetoric indicates otherwise, the human rights situation in Iraq remains too dire to encourage voluntary returns." According to the United Nations, the number of Iraqis who fled their homes has now reached 4.7 million, the highest number since the U.S. invasion. Iraqi refugees living in Damascus told Amnesty about the living conditions in Iraq.
Their houses is being even destroyed or taken by another persons. There is no services like drinkable water, electricity. Even for the hospitals, it's not qualified enough to have medical treatment for the people. For the schools, there is always a frightened from the family about their children. They're concerned about their children from being kidnapping.
In news from Capitol Hill, 2 senior Democratic senators are coming under criticism for accepting special low-interest mortgages from Countrywide Financial, the mortgage firm at the center of the subprime lending crisis. The D.C. watchdog group Citizens for Ethics and Responsibility in Washington has filed an ethics complaint against the 2 Democrats, Chris Dodd of Connecticut and Kent Conrad of North Dakota. The publication Portfolio reported Dodd and his wife saved more than $70,000 because of the special treatment. In other news from Washington, the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee has formally issued a subpoena for FBI reports from interviews with President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney in the CIA leak investigation. On Friday, former White House Press Secretary Scott McClellan is scheduled to testify about the CIA leak case before the House Judiciary Committee. Meanwhile, there's a development in the U.S. attorney scandal. The Wall Street Journal reports federal prosecutors are pursuing their first criminal indictment in the case. The subject of the grand jury is reportedly Bradley Schlossman, the former chief of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Schlossman has been accused of politicizing the Civil Rights Division by staffing it with conservative allies. In legal news, the Supreme Court has agreed to take a case that'll determine whether former Attorney General John Ashcroft, FBI Director Robert Mueller, and others can be sued for damages by Muslim and Arab men rounded up after 9/11. The court's decision will affect several cases, including a class-action lawsuit involving hundreds of former prisoners. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has called for an end to the culture of impunity surrounding the killings of journalists. Ban made the comment as he opened a 32-foot-high glass sculpture in London dedicated to news gatherers and those who work with them, who've been killed in the course of their jobs.
Those who murder journalists don't only stop the free flow of information, they kill the ability of millions of people to have their stories told. This monument stands in tribute to all those who have sacrificed their lives so that the rest of us could be informed. But it is also for those who survive, those who are out there right now risking their lives to report what they uncover in the face of deadly threats.
That's UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Meanwhile, there's a new development in the case of Walid Khalid, a Reuters sound technician who was shot dead by U.S. troops in Baghdad in 2005. The Pentagon's Inspector Generals determined the U.S. soldiers who killed Khalid acted within military rules, but the Inspector General admitted the Army's probe of the incident was tainted by its failure to preserve video evidence of the shooting. An Army investigator allegedly lost video from a Reuters cameraman in the car that captured events leading up to and including the shooting. In other media news, the newspaper chain McClatchy has announced it's cutting 1,400 jobs, 10% of its workforce. The biggest cuts are expected to be at the Miami Herald and the Charlotte Observer. The Tribune newspaper chain has also announced that it is cutting back, it has cutbacks of another sort. The paper plans to eliminate 500 pages a week from its newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Tribune. Tension remains high in Zimbabwe, 10 days ahead of a runoff election between President Robert Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai. On Monday, Mugabe threatened to arrest opposition leaders.
Sooner or rather than later, we are going to accuse the party and the party leadership of being vicariously liable and responsible for those crimes of violence, because there is now a pattern readable across the country, and that has to stop. We want to go into the election exercise peacefully.
In London, President Bush and British Prime Minister Gordon Brown accused Mugabe of orchestrating the violence in Zimbabwe.
Mugabe must not be allowed to steal the election that is now less than 2 weeks away, and that is why we call for Zimbabwe to accept a United Nations human rights envoy to visit Zimbabwe now, and to accept the international monitors from all parts of the world who are available to ensure that this is a free and fair election.
Robert Mugabe has ruled Zimbabwe since it won its independence from Britain in 1980. The devastating flooding in Iowa has sent the price of corn to record highs. On Monday, the price of corn soared above $8 a bushel for the first time ever. The worst flooding in the Midwest in 15 years has affected as many as 5 million acres of farmland. The rising price of corn will also drive higher prices of other food staples, including milk and eggs, as well as many processed foods. While customers are spending more at the supermarket, some companies are profiting. Walmart stock recently hit a 4-year high, in part on the increased spending on groceries. Lawyers for a death row prisoner in Texas scheduled to be executed tonight are claiming the prisoner's conviction should be nullified because the judge in the double murder trial was having an affair with the prosecutor. Charles Hood has been on death row since 1990. On Monday, the state criminal appeals court rejected Hood's appeal, saying his lawyers offered no evidence the alleged affair made a difference in the jury finding Hood guilty. And finally, President Bush has accused a British journalist of slandering America after he challenged Bush on the treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo. Bush's comments came during an interview with British Sky News reporting